Major support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
The Trump administration shot across the bow, so to speak, directed at the international trade with China earlier this year and this spring, continues to be relevant, but not because the U.S. president has backtracked or stopped tweeting or changed what he thinks about it, but rather because for years now, this trade relationship has been seen by insiders and those in the know, non-political, I want to say, as being unfair or at minimum uneven. Welcome again to the longest running and the most widely watched source of Carolina business, policy, and public affairs. I am Chris William, and on this installment, trade is only one issue we will unpack, and later on, the newly minted president of J.C. Smith University, Mr. Clarence Armbrister.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Barings, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Keith Poston of the Public School Forum of North Carolina, Carlos Phillips from the Greenville Chamber of Commerce, and special guest Clarence Armbrister, president of JCSU.
Hello, welcome to our program. Carlos, good to have you back. Good to see you.
Happy to be back.
Keith, welcome. I hope this is a good experience for you.
Yeah, I'm sure it will
Time
be.
will tell.
Great to see you again.
You know, gentlemen, I want to talk to you about something. So we hear over and over daily, and not just because the General Assembly has been in session in the Carolinas, but this idea that we don't pay our teachers enough. I think we all know it. We all agree. Our kids, you know, most valuable resource is in the hands of educators. So I would say that we all want the same thing. Keith, I'll start with you. Why is it so hard to get funding, the appropriate funding for teachers, for principals, for us to really bring to bear a thoughtful education model, in your case in North Carolina?
Well, I mean, I think in North Carolina, it's a matter of priorities. I mean, the fact is we have seen some improvement in teacher pay over the last 2 or 3 years, but just just 5 years ago, 2012, 2013, we had dropped to 46th in the country in terms of teacher pay. And so, it's a matter of putting the right focus, and, you can look at the budgets and see where are the investments going. And while in actual dollars, we've seen some improvements in education, but when you compare it back to the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, teachers are actually making less inflation adjusted than they were then. Our per pupil spending, what we're actually spending on schools in North Carolina, is again some of the lowest in the country, 9th out of 12 states in the Southeast. So, there's a reason why teachers, I think, are frustrated, and we're seeing it play out in other states, where we've seen a lot of activity, and it's because the job, it's not getting easier, the job is getting harder at the same time that the investments that we need, the needs of our students are getting greater. They need to see that we're serious about when we say that they're the most important job we have is educating our children. We need to invest and improve it.
Carlos, same question though. As Keith describes it, if that's the case, why is it boiled down myopically to budget? Shouldn't it mean more than just budget?
Well, budget is important because there are limited resources to go around. So teachers their pay should be commensurate with the value of that career. But budgets are tough, so you move money from one place, it impacts another place. And I think trying to figure that out is a challenge for our legislators. To your point, there is activity that we see across the country right now where states are figuring it out. Not so much by choice, but because They have to. So what we would like to do in South Carolina is figure it out before we have to figure it out.
Do you think if South Carolina does not figure it out, I know, Keith, back to you started talking about statistics, Northern South Carolina 39th, 37th, right around when it comes to teacher pay. If you think Palmetto State doesn't figure it out before North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Florida, wherever, that it puts you back on your heels from an economic developer standpoint?
Well, we are already seeing retention and attraction challenges, attracting teachers to the profession, and now they're not staying longer than 2 or 3 years because of the pay. So we've got to figure it out so that we can keep a pipeline of good quality teachers educating our kids.
And we talk about pay a lot, Chris, but I mean the thing is for the teaching profession, I mean these are professionals, these are college educated, college graduates. Yet, like here in North Carolina, for example, they make a teacher makes about 65% of what a comparable college graduate in another profession makes. And
so if you take out the principal pay of the metric, what's the average pay of a teacher in North Carolina?
Average pay for a teacher right now is right about $50,000.
Is it really?
Yeah.
That's even more than I thought it would be. What's it? Do you know what it is in South Carolina?
I don't know what the number is in South Carolina.
But that can be a little bit misleading, because if you look at some of the wealthier school districts, and I was talking to Carlos back before the show, counties like Mecklenburg and Charlotte, Wake County and Raleigh that pay a lot of extra money on top of what the state pays for teachers. Wake County, for example, and Charlotte are both around $6,000, $7,000 extra. So that kind of skews it a little bit. So you've got a lot of counties that are actually below average. When you get to understand North Carolina and South Carolina, I mean, I'm a native North Carolinian, you realize that it is a very rural state, and outside of 4 or 5 metro areas that are growing and doing pretty well economically, the rest of the state is struggling, and those things show up in how schools are funded. It shows up in how teachers are supplemented in local areas.
Yeah, Carlos, can't you draw a direct line? And I know you've heard this ad nauseum probably the last 2 years you've been in Greenville. Is businesses will say for the past several years now, over and over and over again, we can't find the talent. We don't have enough good talent coming in the pipeline for us to fill these jobs. Right. Can't you draw a direct line from that complaint back to the fact that the teachers in the state are not getting paid enough, but also are not developing those kids and those young adults to stay in to fill those jobs?
Yeah, I think teacher pay impacts economic development to a significant degree. I'll give you an example. Greenville County Schools, each year they conduct a teacher recruitment fair.
And this is upstate South Carolina.
This is in upstate South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina. There were 300 teachers that were in attendance at this recruitment fair, teachers wanting to teach in Greenville County schools, which that's a pretty large number for teachers wanting to teach, new teachers wanting to come into the system. Unfortunately, if all 300 of those teachers had been hired, we'd still be short 200 teachers that we needed for the next school year. It's a challenge. So
to your point, Peter, let's switch gears just a little bit, because this was an important announcement in North Carolina recently. The head of the community college system, as you both know, community college and technical colleges in South Carolina are very critical. Peter Hans was named as the one. How was that received? What do you think that Mr. Hans will have to do to make this community college cohesive? Not that it's not working, but to get it to another level.
Well, I think it's an important announcement. I know Peter is a great guy and a great choice for the job. And look, if he did nothing else, his announcement, you had Speaker Tim Moore, Senate Leader Berger, and Governor Cooper all on the stage in the same room saying this is a great idea. So we can celebrate that. So I give Peter a lot of credit. I think he'll do a good job for that reason. And look, North Carolina, our community college system is one of the crown jewels, along with the University of North Carolina system, and I think the idea that President Spellings and Peter Hans working together along with our K-12 education system is going to be important. We're not being looked at for investments like potential Amazon and other big ones, not just because of our tax rate, but because of our education system and our investments. That's where I talk about priorities. I mean, you ask about the budget and things like that. We're in the running for various investments in South Carolina too. Our tax rates are so low already. They're looking looking for workforce development. They're looking for future workers.
Carlos, in literally the last couple minutes before we meet our guest, some of your biggest members in the chamber, but also the residents in your front yard are some of the biggest exporters in South Carolina. When they hear the Trump administration's rhetoric about trade, and when they see the actual machinations that are going on with trade with China, is it unsettling? Do they notice it? Do they not notice it so much? What's kind of the chatter going on with these large exporters?
That chatter does cause concerns in the area. We do have larger organizations. We have to have global organizations that have a strong presence in South Carolina, whether it's BMW, Michelin, Boeing, Volvo. I mean, it's significant, and so we don't like to hear dialogue that could negatively impact those organizations, the workforces for those organizations. So yeah, it's causing concern.
Do you get a sense that it's gone beyond complaining about it, that they are going to put in place some plans in the event that this becomes a disruptive trade war?
Yeah, these organizations are pretty sharp. So while they're hoping for the best, I'm sure they're planning for worst case scenarios. And I hope we don't get to that point. Yeah. I don't think we will. Our economy is still running strong. Economists are saying that if they compare it to a baseball game, we're in the second game of a doubleheader. So the economy's strong. It's showing no signs really of slowing down. And while the rhetoric doesn't help, I think cooler heads will prevail.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Coming up on our program in the next couple of weeks, certainly next week on the show, it's not all about big business or big policy or big politics here. Sometimes just big ideas. It's a little bit more metaphysical and spiritual, but the founder of an organization called F3, it stands for Faith, I'm sorry, I want to get this right. It stands for Fitness, Fellowship, and Faith. Started out in one town and is now in 25 states, and there are 1,300 weekly sessions of F3 going on across this country. His name is Dave Redding, and he will join us next week. And also the CEO of Colonial Life out of Columbia. His name is Tim Arnold, and he comes back on our program in a couple of weeks. The fate and the fortunes of HBCUs, or historically black colleges and universities, has been the concern of many who support, administer, and attend these schools. But while enrollment in general has declined, a focus on academic and curriculum and, in general, the intentionality of these education institutions has increased. Where can these distinctive universities best compete and participate in the surrounding communities? And plainly, what's their future? Joining us now is Johnson C. Smith University's new president, Clarence Armbrister. Mr. Armbrister, welcome to the program. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Is it culture shock going from Philly down to Charlotte, North Carolina?
Not as much as you might think. I originally grew up in Miami, Florida. So I spent my first 18 years on this life in Miami, and went to Philadelphia to go to undergraduate school. So I've been there for pretty much the last 40 years, but it's nice to come back to the South.
Well, we're glad to have you here. And by the way, my correction, it's Mr. Armbrister, and I know that you probably hear that from time to time, but my apologies, Mr. President. Clarence, you have this background. When you look at your CV, you were a municipal bond banker. You were in public finance. You're a lawyer. You ran endowments for universities, and you were in finance for Temple and Johns Hopkins. So you know, and for the city of Philadelphia. So you know a lot from the financial side, which is a very important thing. Now you've got Johnson C. Smith. Does your CV inform where you're going to take this university and what the vision of what your term is?
In many respects, it does. I think Johnson C. Smith University finds itself at a critical juncture in its existence right now. We have a little bit of an issue. We were recently placed on probation by our accrediting agency, and primarily for financial reasons. So I think when the board, in its wisdom, I would like to say, was seeking a leader to lead it through these times, that it looked for someone who was a non-traditional president. I'm not an academic in the traditional sense, but I have had a lot of experience in higher education, and I think my finance background will be very, very helpful in trying to understand and figure out some of the issues related to Johnson C. Smith's current situation.
Have you felt, since you are not a self-professed non-academic, and I think to some degree maybe, but I've also seen your CV, and you've certainly done well in academics. Do you feel like the faculty and the staff have embraced what this perceived direction is?
I think so. One of the things that I've said to the faculty and staff is that I've created something called the 4 R's, or I've talked about something I've referred to as the 4 R's, what I call the kissing cousins to the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But those 4 R's that I think are really important, and I think if we can move the needle on these 4 R's, that will make sure that Johnson C. Smith has some really sustained success. Those 4 R's are resources, first of all, number 1. Recruitment and retention, number 2. And the last is rigor. As we all know, HBCUs in particular, but colleges and universities throughout the country are resource challenged today. And we need to make sure as a public body politic, and that we invest in education. I was very interested in listening to the conversation that took place before I came on the set regarding the investment or lack thereof in education. Some of it's in teacher salaries, but there are other areas in which investment could take place that would be beneficial to the greater populace. And I've been disappointed, quite frankly, in what I think is a reversal or disinvestment in education at all levels, not only in the levels we talked about in terms of K to 12, but also in higher education, which puts a strain on all of us. And quite frankly, I think it's not good public policy. The greatest expansion in this country has been when, after World War II, we created the GI Bill, and those guys returning from the war were able to get college educations. We need to continue to invest in education at all levels.
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned about the lack of investment, and certainly declining investment in higher education is one of the factors that's driving tuition higher. I mean, as universities, and I've got a senior in high school myself, so I'm sort of getting familiar. I'm familiar with this whole issue. But I got a specific HBCU question. So you probably wouldn't expect me to ask you about Beyonce on a show like this. But let me ask you. Here's my question. HBCUs, in some ways, it feels like even though there may be some questions about the role of HBCUs, in other ways, you kind of having a little bit of a moment, right? You've got, I mean, just in the last few months, you had a couple of huge popular TV shows, This Is Us, Blackish, where you had key stars choosing to go to HBCUs. Beyonce at Coachella, really doing what I think a lot of people describe would say this is really kind of a love letter to HBCUs, kind of like I see. Can you take advantage of that?
Well, we're certainly looking forward to it. I've had a recent conversation with a member of our Board of Trustees where we've talked about literally trying to identify some of those significant iconic figures and make sure that they think about HBCUs when they think about their philanthropy, quite frankly. HBCUs today are as important as they were when there weren't opportunities for African Americans to go to many of the other institutions. I have 2 older brothers, one of whom is recently deceased, but they both went to Florida A&M University at a time when we grew up in Florida in the 1960s where they couldn't go to Florida State. They couldn't go to the University of Florida. Florida A&M provided them an excellent education. They grew up to be outstanding citizens and great net positive contributors to the United States of America. I have 2 children. I have 5 children, 2 of whom have gone to HBCUs, and they've gone for different reasons. They come from 2 different ends of the educational attainment spectrum, if you will. I had a daughter who went to Spelman, who was a great student, probably could have gone anywhere. She did extremely well at Spelman. She kind of found her stride there. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa magna cum laude. I had a son who came to dear old North Carolina and graduated from North Carolina Central. Took him a little longer than we would have liked, particularly since I was out of state. But he did graduate, and that's a very important, particularly for a young African American man. So, he was embraced just as she was embraced by her institution. They got nurturing. They got support in ways that they might not have at other institutions. But it's important to note that HBCUs are not just limited to students and families of African descent. We at Johnson C. Smith have a growing Latino population, for example. I just met with the Latino students recently, and they're becoming a more important part of our campus. And we want to make sure that we encompass all students because cultural diversity is really important going forward.
Sure. Carlos?
The real competition today for communities is not so much for jobs as it is for talent. I recently chaired the United Negro College Fund mask ball in Greenville.
Oh, did you? Okay.
I did. And I did it because, one of the reasons I did it was because I wanted to raise awareness amongst our employer community about the rich talent
Absolutely.
that comes out of HBCUs. What do you think? Where is Johnson C. Smith's the talent, the employer awareness to that talent?
Outstanding, and one of the things that I want to do is to continue to make it known, particularly in this region and other regions, how talented our students are. People ask me all the time, what has been the biggest surprise? And it's not so much a surprise, but I have been so impressed with the quality of the students at Johnson C. Smith. Just give you one small anecdotal example. My wife, her name is Denise Armbrister, is a banker, and during Women's International Month, the students at Johnson C. Smith decided they wanted her to speak. To her credit, she said, look, I don't want to get up and give a speech about myself, but why don't we do an interview? Mm-hmm. And so they had a student interview her. The student was phenomenal, a sophomore. Young lady who was a sophomore. We were all so impressed. We were more impressed with her than my wife, but my wife has a great opportunity as well. But she was just outstanding. And that's just one small example of the quality of the students. And part of my job is to make sure that employers and other members of chambers of commerce and others like that get to understand that Johnson C. Smith students and students at other HBCUs are really, really talented individuals, in part because they show resilience. They've overcome so many obstacles to get where they are. Many times they're the first generation college graduates, as I and my brothers were in our family. It really is important to take a hard look. If you're a business out there looking for talent, if you don't look at an HBCU, it's at your loss.
You know, so take, as you just described it, Mr. President, take that idea of taking a hard look. Where does, whether it's an HBCU or whether it's Johnson C. Smith University, as the university, what is their role in an environment like Charlotte, because that's where you are, in leadership around the whole idea now that we're calling economic mobility and economic opportunity? Mm-hmm. How do you lead, and how do you make sure it's not just about African Americans or Latinos or white kids or white people or whatever? How do you make sure that you're out front in this whole dialogue and saying, this is important for X? What's X?
Well, part of it is becoming involved in the greater community and not being isolated to the campus. So part of that is my responsibility to make sure that I become, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, to have these dialogues with leaders of business and commerce to make sure that they understand that. But the most important part is the proof is in the pudding, which are results. And as I said to the staff and faculty at Johnson C. Smith, we're going to ultimately be judged on results. You talked about one of the jobs that I had, which was an investment banker. The first day that I got there, they knew I'd been a good lawyer. They knew I was a good guy. But they came up to me and they said, you know, Clay, what you're going to be judged on is the bottom line, and that's results. And here, results mean here being at the investment bank meant that how am I going to contribute to the bottom line? For us, it's student success. It's our ability to fulfill our mission, which is to make sure that we produce students that think critically. We may produce students that can learn independently as well as collaboratively, and students who can demonstrate that they have, in fact, acquired the skills necessary to be good either students or workers or graduate students or whatever. So we look to be judged on our results, and I'm proud to say, in terms of our students, we produce really high-quality students.
We have about 2 minutes left.
Economic mobility, just to sort of carry on to that. So what kind of, you think there's a unique role that a Johnson C. Smith and HBCU can play in that? I mean, Chris is right. It affects a lot of folks. But look, when we're talking about poverty in an area like Charlotte Metro, we really are talking about, you know, black students, Latino students, and there are real sort of structural, historical challenges. Yeah. What does an HBCU see as its unique role?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that I've been impressed with, and in terms of getting out in the community, is the Charlotte's community's interest in making sure that one really bad statistics out there, that they were 50th out of 50 cities in terms of economic mobility of children of color in this community. Well, I don't think there's any institution, and I say this without fear of contradiction or reservation, that's better prepared to move the needle on a statistic like that than a place like Johnson C. Smith. As I mentioned earlier, many of our students are first-time, first-generation college graduates. We can help mold those students to become productive citizens and workers for this community. So I'm looking forward, if we can get the resources that we need, if we can make sure that we can recruit and retain the talented students, which is a function of resources in many instances, and if we continue to provide the rigorous education that we do, I think that we can move the needle significantly on an issue like that.
We have less than a minute left, Carlos, so I'm sorry, I'm going to ask him a quick follow-up. Just how are you going to deploy the resource of finding resources? We've got about 30 seconds.
Well, that really is a challenge. Part of that is looking to our alumni, and looking for those investors, and I think it is an investment. People have to understand that they're going to get a return, those who are willing to make the investment in education, be it philanthropy, foundations. I think we need to return to that public debate and talk about government's role in supporting education at all levels, including higher education.
President Armbrister, please come back. We didn't even talk about student financing or any of the fun stuff, right?
I know. I'd be happy to. Thank you.
It's nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Carlos, welcome. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
Keith, good job.
Thank you, sir.
Come back.
Appreciate it.
Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night. Bye.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, Barings, Grant Thornton, Novant Health, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.